Welcome, everybody. Great to see you all. My name's Katie Luvis. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs at the Chamber for Greater Chapel Hill Carborough, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to the annual State Legislative Forum. This forum is the fifth and final forum in our 2020 policy series. These forums connect thinking leaders with leading thinkers. Today, we're getting the state of play on state legislative affairs. We have three special guest speakers who will share their reflections and predictions on the North Carolina General Assembly and share updates on issues that matter to our local business community. Before we get the program started, a few housekeeping items. First, as far as staffing for today's Zoom discussion, I'll serve as your host, and our Chamber President and CEO, Erin Nelson, will moderate our panel, so you know it'll really sizzle. My colleague Jensen Anderson will be on slides and technology, so you can rest assured that Jensen will apply her quick ninja moves on any potential Zoom hacker. If you have any questions or comments during the forum, please post them in the chat box below. I'll be monitoring that throughout our event, and we'll help tee up any questions for panel discussion during the Q&A period. As you probably noticed, your line was muted when you joined this meeting, and we ask that you remain muted. But please do share your video if you're comfortable doing so, because we love to see your smiling faces. Today's discussion will be recorded and shared through our YouTube channel. We'll send you a link in our follow-up email after the event. This forum, like many of our forums, is free for Chamber members. If you're not a Chamber member but are interested in learning more, drop a note in the chat box and my colleague Rebecca Dickinson or one of our other staff members will be sure to follow up with you. Today's forum and the entire 2020 policy series is coordinated by the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee. And the chair of the Government Affairs Committee, Betsy Rucker-Harris, would like to bring you welcome. Betsy is the IT project coordinator for Armacell, a global company that invented flexible foam and manufactures innovative technical insulation solutions that conserve energy and make a positive difference. Armacell has 300 patents, 3,000 employees, and 24 facilities around the world, including their head office for the Americas in Chapel Hill and a manufacturing facility in Mebane. Betsy?
Thank you so much, Katie, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of our 27 volunteer members of the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this fifth and final policy series event of the year, the State Legislative Forum. For those of you who are new to our events, you should know that we're a learning community. While you may be tempted to sit back, relax, we encourage you to lean in, pose questions, and engage in discussion. We've got a couple ways to do that, and you should know that we're a social group. We invite you to share any ahas or comments in the Zoom chat box, or tweet your favorite takeaways on Twitter with the hashtag CHC Policy Series. We'll go ahead and share that in the chat if you need it to be able to see it. It's my joy to serve on the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee and to help coordinate these forums. In addition to these forums, our committee convenes monthly to discuss policy matters and coordinate the Chamber's collective advocacy on behalf of the local business community. We focus on four things. We retain, recruit, and grow employers in the area. We work on developing a talented workforce, improving the business climate and regulatory environment, and building and maintaining infrastructure in our community. If this sounds great to you and you're interested in being considered for the 2021 slate of nominees for our committee, I encourage you to let me or Katie know of your interest, and we'll get back to you. We'll discuss the committee roles and responsibilities with you. And with that, I want to share my appreciation to our distinguished elected officials who have joined us today as panelists. I hope you all enjoy the program. Katie?
Thanks, Betsy. Today's forum would not be possible without the support of our 2020 policy series sponsors, Durham Technical Community College, Duke Energy, and Silver Spot Cinema. First, Durham Tech. Durham Tech is the community college that serves our workforce needs here in Orange County. They have a beautiful 20-acre, 40,000 square foot campus centrally located in Orange County near Hillsborough. And they just recently secured funding from the Orange County Commissioners to begin planning for the expansion of that campus. With us today is their president, JB Buxton. JB is a longtime leader of public education in North Carolina. He was a White House Fellow. He is on the State Board of Education, and he is now the 5th president of Durham Tech. JB, we're glad to have you. Please bring welcome to our participants.
Katie, thank you very much. I am pleased to be here. We're proud members of the Chamber and proud sponsors of this policy series. I want to say I'm joined by Beth Payne, our Director of Corporate Education Services. And I also believe I saw Ellen Shannon, who's on the Durham Tech Foundation, with us this morning. I am excited about this forum. You've got 3 members of the legislature who have been leaders in public education and human services really for a long time. And I feel privileged to have had the chance to work with them and thankful that they were able to join this today. I'm also excited. I'm on the Orange County campus this morning. I'm working out of here today. We've got a number of Air Force members from around the country who are working with Durham Tech to do critical care training. And we've got some EMS classes here that I'll be dropping in on with my mask, to be quite clear. But as Katie said, we are extremely excited about the investment that Orange County is making in its residents with the expansion of this campus. And they had long decided to invest in an expansion of Orange County, but they have since moved it up in the schedule. We're going to have planning beginning this year and construction over the next couple of years to be able to increase any number of services, but including our healthcare services, our public safety, think EMS and law enforcement, our work with the Orange County and Chapel Hill Carrboro Public Schools. We think this is a critical time to expand access to education, and we're thankful to the Orange County Commissioners and the residents of Orange County who agree with that and who have supported this in deep ways. We're also thankful for representatives like we have today. Education has always been a significant state and local partnership. It needs both. And we've got folks on today who believe that. I think we're going to be tested in that partnership with the level of need we have in our communities. But I'm excited to see what we can do in Durham and Orange counties and in the state of North Carolina. Katie, thanks again for putting this together and for allowing us to be part of it.
Thanks, JB. It's great to have you at the helm of Durham Tech. We also appreciate Duke Energy for their sponsorship of this forum and our 2020 policy series. Did you know that Duke Energy is one of the largest energy holding companies in the United States? They provide power to nearly 10 million customers across half a dozen states. And they were named one of the world's most admired companies by Fortune magazine in 2020 and one of America's best employers by Forbes in 2019. They're building a smarter energy future, and we appreciate their support for these thoughtful events. We also appreciate Silver Spot Cinema. Our policy series regulars, they know that we normally hold these forums in person at the cinema, where we can sink into their enormous leather reclining chairs and view the presentations up on the big screen. It's really awesome. Unfortunately, the pandemic is limiting our ability to enjoy their venue as a group, but please keep them in mind for your organization's 2021 programming when it's safe to do so. They're an upscale boutique movie theater that offers sophisticated professional meeting experiences, and we appreciate their partnership on this 2020 policy series. All right, now on to the program. As I mentioned before, the Chamber President and CEO, Aaron Nelson, will moderate our panel today. Aaron has led the Chamber for nearly 20 years. He's a Carolina grad, and he's always quick with a joke or an insightful comment. Aaron, take it away.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm very excited to see everybody here today. I'm grateful that you've chosen to join us this morning for this important conversation. We are going to hear from our legislative delegation today, and we are very excited that they are joining us from, I think, their homes probably this morning rather than Raleigh. And now we're going to break our today's conversation into 6 different segments. We're going to cover a lot of critical issues, but first we're going to begin with a proper introduction of these exceptional panelists. First will be Honorable Verla Insko, who has served as a state representative for District 56, that's Orange County, in our House of Representatives. She has a master's degree in public administration, a former health administrator at the UNC School of Medicine. She was first elected to the General Assembly in 1997, and I think that puts her now in her 12th term, which may make her one of the longest serving stateswomen in the General Assembly. She credits her parents, both of them products of the Great Depression, and out of the Midwest, with greatly influencing her life in this political philosophy that she has shared with all of us, inspiring her lifelong commitment to public service. So Representative Insko, we are very glad to have you with us today. Next is the Honorable Valerie P. Foushee, who serves as our state senator for District 23, that is Chatham and Orange counties, representing us in the North Carolina Senate. She is a lifelong resident of Orange County, a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a former official with the Chapel Hill Police Department, where she supervised 2 units and administered a budget of $11 million. She was first elected to the General Assembly in 2012, after she had served 6 years on the Orange County Board of Commissioners, where she was the chair. She also served a term or 2 on the Chamber's Board of Directors, representing the county commissioners. In the General Assembly, Valerie is an advocate for bipartisan reform of education funding and policy, and is really working on transparency and making sure that we are appropriately funding our school districts. She was recently elected to a leadership position for the state of North Carolina's Democratic Party. Third will be the Honorable Graig Meyer, who serves as our state representative for District 50, y'all, that is Caswell and Orange counties, in our North Carolina House of Representatives. He's a trained social worker, has more than 20 years of experience working in public school issues. You all may remember him when he was the coordinator of the Blue Ribbon Mentor Advocate Program. He was also the director of student equity for the Chapel Hill Carborough City School System. He was first elected in 2013, and he approaches legislation, he says, with an eye towards protecting those who are marginalized, vulnerable, and oppressed. If you've ever visited him in his office, or you can return there again in the future, you know he has a record player and lets you pick what you wish, and you can listen to it. Also, one of the social media leaders in our General Assembly. So, welcome, Representative Meyer. So the way that we are going to begin is, this is my first question, and I'll call on each of you. So we'd like for you to sort of open with taking a few minutes to tell us a little bit about yourself, your service currently in the General Assembly, maybe some of the priorities that are really important to you right now. So let's begin with Representative Insko. Welcome, Verla.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this morning. And I want to say congratulations to JB. It's really been interesting watching your progression over the years from when I first met you. And I think you're in a wonderful position. I think that the community colleges are in a really good place right now. And I think you'll do a great job, and it'd be interesting to work with you, and please stay in touch. So I've lived in North Carolina since 1965. And I came here, my husband was a university professor, and I had been teaching, and his first job was at the University of Hawaii. And I taught at the Kamehameha schools, which is a really interesting experience. And when we moved here, the schools really were not as up to par with either Hawaii or California. And Chapel Hill Carborough School still had the best system in the state, but did not equal. So I got involved with a local community. I could not afford to teach here, but got involved with the local community in nonprofits, and then ran for the school board in 1976 with the intention of improving schools. And that does come from my background. My family moved to California at 5'5", and I was very fortunate to get into good public schools. My parents had been through the Depression and had experienced hunger. And I remember my older brother saying, "Mom, I'm hungry." I don't ever remember being hungry myself, but that, I think it did make a huge impression on me. And I'm so proud of my parents, they were very strong. And I think you had to be to succeed in those days. And so education had benefited my family, and I was determined that it would also benefit all the children in North Carolina. So ran for the school board, went to the county board of county commissioners, partly because they helped fund the schools, and then went to the General Assembly when there was an opening there. Everyone likes to go to education in the General Assembly, and so the Speaker asked me to go to Health and Human Services, and with my healthcare background, it was a good fit for me. My major was biology and I minored in chemistry in college. And so I also work on the environment committee, and anything that has much to do with science, I'm usually involved in it. And I was, I guess one of my proud bills was that I was the primary sponsor of inclusive care, which was North Carolina's high risk pool. We didn't have high risk then. And so we had a state-run insurance company called Inclusive Care, and it was for people with pre-existing conditions. And when Medicaid expansion came, I think we no longer needed that program, but it was a very successful program while we had it. Thank you very much for inviting me this morning.
We are grateful to have you here. And I did not know of your move from Hawaii. I am a product of Hokalani Elementary School, and we also moved here from Honolulu to Chapel Hill on a faculty move.
Huh.
We'll follow up later.
Right.
And talk about
Maui no Ka'oi.
Senator Foushee, welcome. We are so glad to have you with us. Will you bring welcome?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you all for having me. It is good to be with friends and partners in service. I'm glad to know that we are still of interest to you, given where we've been over this year in 2020. Just a little bit about me and a couple of corrections. I did serve for 8 years on the Orange County Commission for a full 2 terms, and 2 terms on the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools Board. I think most of you know that I grew up in Chapel Hill, and I grew up during a time where it was very difficult to advance in any particular way as an African American, and certainly not as an African American woman. So I am grateful for this community, for the opportunity to serve, and for the opportunity to give back to a community that has given so much to me. I have, as you've heard, been in the General Assembly now for 4 full terms, and have been mostly working with education and healthcare. And so I'll just briefly say that those things that I think come to the forefront, or should come to the forefront when we return in 2021, is that given where we've been with this pandemic, that we ensure that we adequately fund public education so that no child is left behind because that child is either hungry, that child does not have access to broadband, and that child does not have the full opportunity to be successful. And so it is incumbent upon us to ensure that that funding is in place. And I will say to you quickly that that means that the General Assembly has to pass a budget for the 2021-2022 biennium. We need to ensure, given where we've been with the pandemic, that we have access to healthcare for all North Carolinians. I still believe the easiest way to do that, the quickest way to do that, is to expand Medicaid. And finally, I will say that for us to move forward and not understand how important it is that we expand broadband access throughout the state of North Carolina means that we are not serving the people as best as we can. So I'll stop with that and wait for and anticipate and hopefully enjoy answering your questions.
We thank you, Senator Foushee. We are glad to have you. I will make a correction on your service. We are grateful to have you with us today, and I will be following up on some of those education priorities. Representative Meyer, welcome.
Good morning, Aaron. Thanks for having me. You know, it's always interesting when you have the 3 of us from our legislative delegation. You're going to get a heavy dose of education. And I always joke that the first time I ran on a 1-note campaign of education, which can work in Orange County. But when you get to the legislature, you realize that you can't really specialize on only one thing. And so I've really become more of a generalist. I still probably work more than anything on education in the General Assembly, but I love serving on the Finance Committee. That's our tax policy committee. I've done a good amount of bipartisan work on the Alcoholic Beverage Control Committee, some of which motivated by some of our local distillers and brewers that have asked for my help on issues. I've been working a lot this year with local restaurateurs to try and help them navigate the pandemic. And then because my district stretches from rural Orange County all the way up through Caswell County, I've been spending an increasing amount of time on those issues affecting rural North Carolina, broadband access being the one I certainly hear the most from my constituents about, but also issues impacting North Carolina's farmers, transportation issues. When you get to the General Assembly, it's really hard to just focus on one thing.
We are grateful that you were with us today. We'll be coming back around to infrastructure and education shortly, but I wanted to sort of check in with y'all. Senator Foushee, you said that nicely I guess when you opened, you said that you're grateful that we're still engaged with you all despite what is going on. But it's probably the case that many of us have been focused on local crisis and not paying as much attention to what the legislature has been up to. Would each of you share with us maybe your reflections on the last session? Is there a single word you might use to describe it? You'd like to share with your constituents the good, the bad, the ugly on this last session. Senator Foushee, let me start with you, and then I'll go to Verla.
So I have mixed emotions about the last session. Certainly there were times when it was very frustrating not to be able to move forward legislation that I believed and many of us believed would have been helpful for many North Carolinians. But I will say that once we came back to engage and determine how CARES relief funding was to be distributed across the state of North Carolina, I found it very enriching that we acted as a bipartisan group of people who were more concerned about how we were helping our constituents. That happened during that session more so than any other time in my tenure. In the Senate, we were fully engaged. The President Pro Tem allowed, heard from, and used our input to put forward a package that was, as you all know, ultimately voted unanimously to pass that chamber. For me, it is what we're supposed to be doing in the General Assembly. That is only one, there was only one other time that I felt that we had acted in a bipartisan fashion, and that was when the Senate took on its responsibility and its role for doing the new redistricting that occurred for our last election. So seeing that we were able to do that and understanding that that was something that could be and should be replicated gave me hope. It is my hope that when we return, we will continue to work in that fashion.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Insko, your reflections on this last session, and then I'll come to you, Graig.
Well, that's an interesting question. This last session was so different than any session that we've had. It was an adjustment, I guess. Working virtually, a lot of the meetings were virtual. I've had more one-on-one collaboration with the Republicans. I think I've found if you work one-on-one with them, that they're more willing and able to work one-on-one rather than as a group. I think our caucus is our Republican caucus is programmed largely. I have a special concern about the way the budget's done, and I apologize about the light. My other computer that is in the light couldn't hook up this morning, but so it'll come and go. I do have a special concern about the budget. The budget really is never done, has not been done in the last few years in the traditional way where everybody was actually engaged and the subcommittees actually met and made decisions. I think the decisions are all being made by a few people at the top, and then the decisions are sent down. And that's really not, that's not good for the state. We really do need the input of everybody from all the regions across the state. And that's one of my major concerns, I think, about the way the General Assembly has been functioning over the last few years. We did have some, once COVID struck, I think it did improve. There was an obvious need, and the model was sent from the national level, I think, to get things done. And I think we work better together then. But it's just been very difficult. Except one-on-one, you can build relationships, but as a body, we're not functioning very well at all. That's my take on the House.
That's really helpful to hear. Representative Meyer?
I think Senator Foushee and Representative Insko did a good job of describing kind of what was the atmosphere and the some of the ways that we were able to work together on coronavirus response, some of the ways we weren't. To me, it's all, what's underneath all of that is the fact that we don't have a currently enacted budget, as Senator Foushee said, and we're working on what's called a continuation budget, which basically means the 2018 budget is still in effect, and we're running off of those old numbers. Well, even with the impact of the pandemic, the state is still accruing revenue at a rate faster than we are spending it because of not having an enacted budget. We have $4.5 billion of unappropriated revenue right now, on top of our $2.5 billion in our rainy day fund and the money that we have in our unemployment reserves. That's big money, a lot of money. And I am still floored that in the short session of 2020, we didn't do more. I know we were worried about what was the economic impact going to be of the pandemic, but we didn't do more for small businesses that were hurt the most by it in North Carolina. When Democrats went into the session, one of our priorities was to introduce a specific targeted fund for small businesses that were forced to close by the governor's executive orders, because we knew that if you're, say, a restaurant or a movie theater, Silver Spot, you're not able to be open at all. You don't have the ability to even maintain basic revenue to pay your fixed expenses like rent. Governor Cooper later put in place a $40 million fund to help businesses with those expenses. But we thought that the legislature should use CARES money, or maybe some of our rainy day money. We've never had a rainier day than this, to help provide targeted assistance. And a bit of gamesmanship, we introduced a $50 million plan. The Republicans stole it and turned it into a $100 million plan, which the House passed, but the Senate never took that up. And so I'm just amazed that at the end of this year, we have all of this money sitting on the table when the state is still hurting so much.
Greg, before we move to the next segment, we want to talk about workforce development, university funding, community college. On the finance committee, what are y'all's projections? Are you worried about major reductions in revenue going forward?
So last year, the worst case scenario was that we could see a 20% to 40% reduction in revenue. And I think that's why the legislative leadership decided to spend the federal money and not dive into the state money. In hindsight, I think that looks like a bad decision because we have all this money left over. And then one of the other things that was really difficult for us was that our own internal economists would not give us a revenue projection. They said that they couldn't. And so we were really left in the dark on that. At this point, it looks like revenues will still be down somewhere less than 20%. And that it probably in the next year, we will have to close some of the budget hole with some of that leftover revenue. That'll be non-recurring revenue, right? You can only spend it once. But I think that's going to be one of the biggest policy debates when we get into the next session is where are we on revenue and how much of that existing balance should we use? I would guess the Republicans will say they want to give some of that back, like in a tax rebate form or something. And I think the Democrats will probably argue that there's some significant investments that we need to make right now in things like rural broadband or the conversion to renewable energy, for instance.
That's a good transition to spending some money. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in workforce development. We know that with the unemployment and folks moving from jobs that they had before, maybe they're going to be coming into new work opportunity. We're very lucky that Durham Tech made a fast pivot early on and created their Back to Work initiative. Hopefully everybody on the line has had a chance to check that out. It offers a low-cost, quick turn credentialing, really help people with immediate training, preparing them for new employment needs. But as we think about the workforce priorities in a sort of at the end of this pandemic and a post-pandemic world, starting with you again, Senator Foushee, can you help us think about what the legislature's priorities are going to be, or your priorities regarding funding our community colleges, making sure that our university survives this pandemic economically? Can you talk again about universities and community college funding as a state, or your priorities going forward?
Sure, and thank you for that question. I think that over time, and certainly where we are now, and given that I did serve on the board of directors for Durham Tech, I think we've seen over time that in these situations, our community college system, we are grateful for it because it is one of the best in the country. And what we have seen is that when people are looking to retrain, people are looking to reinvest or move to different occupations or preparing for a different phase of their lives, that our system always delivers. And so it is important that we really take a look at providing free community college for residents of this state. I think that we know it can be done. We've seen in certain districts that local governments have taken on that responsibility to ensure that graduates from their school districts get that education. The state should make that investment. I think that the university system fared better in this last session than it has in any session that I've served in the General Assembly. And certainly we should continue that, understanding that the revenue that would have been gained was not, and that we have to ensure that we are able to move forward past the pandemic and have people to be relieved of the stress that they're feeling now about whether or not we're going to be able to provide adequate education. So I'll stop there.
Well, let me just go one further with you. Do you anticipate, should the university expect cuts from the legislature? Should our community college, or is this a time where you expect that they will be invested in?
I think they'll be invested in, and I certainly am not going to project that we won't invest in our community college system or the UNC system. I certainly can say, even though I don't speak for my colleagues, we will certainly not push forward or support anything that does anything other than to provide adequate funding.
Thank you. Representative Insko in the House, I'll come to you, Graig, in just a second. Do you see that a strong level of support for investing in higher education right now?
I see a special interest in the community college system. I think there's a great deal of support in the North Carolina House and the Senate for our community college system. You know, we have young people now coming out of college, getting their bachelor's degrees and not being able to find jobs. That's a high priority for young people now. They spend a lot of time looking for jobs. And so many of them actually go back to a community college and get a technical degree or a certificate in order to get into the job market. So I think there's a growing awareness of the need to expand that program and to offer more offerings at that level. I do anticipate some cuts at the university level, and I think there'll be a lot of opposition to that. I hope we come out on the right side of that, but that's a high priority concern for me. I'm going to veer off a little bit into early childhood and our K through 12 system, because that's where kids get prepared to go to college. And we are really failing, especially at the early childhood level. We have fewer children now who are in our early childhood programs that actually prepare them to succeed in school. And so I'm concerned about the population that's coming up through the next generation. We've got to get we've got to have our workforce keep up with our jobs. We're very grateful for and fortunate to continue to have good immigration coming from across the nation and from foreign countries. A lot of our economic development is coming from people who are coming into the state, and so we're fortunate there that's going on. But we're still not doing, especially in the rural areas, we're really failing our population there. So those are some of my high priorities.
Oh, it's a good and helpful reminder that there's a long continuum in education. Greg, you've worked in our public school system. You've observed the importance of our university and community college, but what are your predictions for this coming session?
I think one thing that I'm worried about related to university system is the changing demographic trends. So on top of the pandemic, you have the tail end of the millennial boom, and that the generation, the next few years of students who would be matriculating into universities, we start getting smaller and smaller cohorts. And so I think you're going to hear some rhetoric around right-sizing the university or some language like that that really does portend additional potential financial threats to the university, and the university itself is going to have to look at what does it mean if you have decreasing enrollment. I know that we have private colleges, not necessarily in our county, but I mean, as close as Guilford College, that are at significant risk of closing because of the combined threats of the demographic changes and the pandemic hitting them at the same time. So it's going to be a rough time, I think, for higher education, particularly as UNC has been pretty transparent in saying, particularly in anything that depends on revenue that's generated by the university, student revenue, or just athletic revenue, whatever it is. We're going to have a really difficult time figuring out what to do in the short run, at least, about replacing that revenue. But along with, as my colleague said, I think we'll advocate to try and keep the university whole and keep the university system in place so that it can continue to do the excellent job that it has always done when we come out the other end of the pandemic. In K-12 education, the big question will be, what do we do about the Leandro court case? This is a landmark court case where the courts have found that the state has not adequately supported low wealth public schools all over the state, and has the plaintiffs and the court have agreed to a set of remedies, but the legislature is not a party in the case. And so it's unclear how the legislative leadership will respond to those findings and the need to provide additional support. I am heartened that our new superintendent of public instruction, who is a Republican, but has a long history of working in public education, she has said that she thinks that addressing the Leandro decision is the single most important thing we need to do. And so I hope that she'll work with our legislative leadership to try and take that on over the next couple of years.
I am muted. Representative Meyer, we're going to stay with you on this next question, and then Senator Foushee, I'll come to you second. Let's talk about infrastructure. Among the chamber priorities, transportation, energy, broadband, workforce housing, parks, public amenities. Can you talk to us about what your priorities are with respect to infrastructure, or where you'd like to be spending your time, or what you're hoping to work on or get accomplished there?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, and as you already heard, all three of us talk about, the thing that I hear the most about from constituents is rural broadband access. And that's particular to my district, given that I have rural Orange County, which has a surprising amount of area that has no consistent broadband access, and then into Caswell County, where things are even worse. The legislature has a small grant program to try and support rural communities with developing broadband options. But it's nothing compared to what needs to be done. The federal government will be announcing a gigantic broadband grant program. They'll be announcing the recipients and the maps of who's going to get served at some point in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And so we will see the beginning of broadband expansion in North Carolina in a meaningful way when that federal grant program is announced. It probably won't touch much of Orange County. But it could help close the overall state gaps and then allow the state to figure out how we can fill in the remaining areas. And then I'm also very interested in energy issues, and think that we have to make some significant decisions about how does our energy sector work, both in the generation of energy, of how are we switching over to renewables, and the transmission of energy. What do we do with our aging transmission system? And how do we set up a system where you have a regulated monopoly that runs both of those things right now and is the retail seller to most North Carolinians? But how do we move to a system where we probably need more inputs in terms of energy creation, especially for renewables? And we really have to kind of change the economic balance that exists in the state among the interests of who's producing, distributing, and selling, and then those of us that are consumers, balancing all of that against what we need to do for the environment.
Senator Foushee, what are your priorities on infrastructure, and where do you think the legislature is going to be going with that this coming session?
Well, certainly I ditto everything that Representative Meyer said, particularly as it relates to energy production. But I must say that as he represents Caswell County, I also represent Chatham County, where we know that expansion of broadband is critical, and it is critical that we do it as soon as possible. The only other thing that I will add to what has already been said as it relates to infrastructure is that you all know that we have been trying to get a school construction bond passed for a number of years, and I will continue to focus on providing funding for schools to be repaired and for the additional seats that we need that have been forced on school districts by the legislature. So I'll stop with that.
Representative Insko, do you have comments to add on your priorities, legislative priorities with respect to infrastructure?
Well, I think broadband is probably at the top of everyone's list. It's been an issue. There's a lot of bipartisan support for that, and now there's support at the national level also. So I think we'll probably see some good movement in that area, and I think that'll be a relief to everyone. I guess I would say that I have some concerns about the rural-urban divide that seems to be growing in North Carolina. I think that broadband would help us bridge that gap some, but I think that there's also more, we're forgetting about the rural part of our state and making sure we have all of our infrastructure there. Roads are deteriorating. You know, we've been known as a good road state for a long time, but we have some major problems, and our transportation department's been having some problems. So there are problems to watch, and I hope that that we can spend some time there. I also would just mention renewables. I think the governor has a really forward-looking climate change program, and I hope we can make some progress there. I think it's really critical. It's a critical issue that I hope we can spend some time on.
Let's stick with transportation just for a second as a critical infrastructure issue. And I know it is a priority for each of you. So can you tell us specifically what you think the state can do? It's been a bit of a mess, right? We had a light rail system that isn't going to happen. We have a state of North Carolina Department of Transportation that sort of is out of funds. And what is the legislature going to do to help with transportation priorities? Anybody can go ahead. Greg, I saw you unmute yourself.
I mean, only because I know no one really wants to answer this question. No offense to my colleagues, but it's a mess. Like, our transportation system is a mess. And in the last 4 years, to be honest, no one got transportation right. The legislature didn't, and the governor didn't. And, you know, it's one thing just to look at the shortage of funds and the way DOT ran out of funds, which again had fault both from the legislative side and the governor's side. But it's another thing to think not just about what do we screw up in hindsight, but what do we really need to do? Because we have to maintain existing transportation infrastructure, which is expensive just to do that, and think about what additional transportation infrastructure we need. But when we think about where do we go from here on transportation, we have to look at it through the lens of climate change most of all, because transportation is such a huge contributor to climate change. And so how do we reduce the total amount of time and distance traveled on roads? how do we, but then you balance that against how do we give access to our urban economies to folks that are living in rural areas? And so you can think about urban-rural equity issues in some ways balancing against that. I don't know that, I mean, if Representative Insko or Senator Foushee have a quick, easy, and perfect answer, I'd love to hear it, because I've tried to look at this and just don't see it.
I do not.
Well, let me, to the three of you, a question that came through the chat. We have a great transportation system here in Chapel Hill, Carrboro, right? But it's the case that 70% of UNC and UNC hospital employees don't live in the Chapel Hill, Carrboro transportation system. So the question was, is there any way that the state can use CARES funds or other funds to help with more regional solutions to get people to and from work in our community?
Let me just start by saying that, you know, when we received CARES funding, that funding came with a set of guidelines. In some situations, they were very clear as to how those funds could be used. In others, they were not. What we found difficult in the Senate was trying to earmark funding for the needs that we saw, but then finding that perhaps we could not use those funds in that manner. And so we started out by putting those funds aside, or earmarking an amount to set aside, so that when we got clear guidelines that we could perhaps funnel those funds to those needs. And that was not the case. So I would hope, and I would say to the person who put that question forward, if that is indeed the case when we receive the next round of CARES funding, I'm sure that we will do everything we can to ensure that that funding goes or is directed to those needs. But I can't ensure that they will. And I don't know that, you know, we've talked with our congressional representatives, and they agree and they understand. But getting that to move forward with the gridlock that we've seen in DC, I don't know that it will happen.
I appreciate y'all making it go with that. Verla, go ahead.
Well, I think our local situation is a model, a bad model. But you know, we've been working here in Orange County for a long time to try to work out our transportation system, and we really have not come together yet as a community on the best way to go forward or to move on it. And so I think that's true at the state level too, that there's not enough collaboration to come to an agreement across the aisle and between different parties that have different priorities. So I think just more work, intentional work, that we're going to actually reach a solution and have a common goal would help. And I hope that we can take some leadership on that.
I'll add, for the business community, we hope it's not just across political lines, but these county lines that we drew in the 1700s no longer adequately represent our labor shed. And so much is bound up in county decisions or in municipal decisions when we have regional challenges, and thinking about from a state level what you guys can do to help support regional efforts or create regional funding. I think that would help support some of this as well. We have the CEO of Habitat is on this call, and she had put in a question on infrastructure related to workforce housing. Greg, you saw that question and offered to take a go of it. Would you restate her question, please, and then offer your response?
Sure. So, hi, Jennifer. Good to see you. And Jennifer asked in the chat, I think people can see it, about we have this risk of impending evictions when the eviction moratorium is lifted, and we know that folks are having economic struggles, and points out that any eviction crisis that comes would also have an impact on landlords, and then of course whoever the creditors are. So this is something that can create a real cyclical economic problem. In the short session, well, actually, I'm going to say this to set the stage. In the time that I've been in the legislature, we have done no significant legislation on housing. not a single bill specifically on housing. And basically what we put in the budget is to kind of maintain North Carolina's low level of housing investment, but nothing to really improve workforce housing or take care of high needs critical housing for things like homelessness, nothing. So I was really happy in the short session when one of my Republican colleagues, John Zoka, from Cumberland County, put forth a bill that would have appropriated money to help pay for people who were facing eviction, help pay their rent. Now, John Zoka is a mortgage broker, so he did it out of some self-interest because his folks need to not go bankrupt on their mortgages. But guess what? If that's his motivation and I want to protect people that are going to get evicted, I can work across the aisle with that guy. And I went to him and I said, John, I think this is the most important bill that we've seen introduced this session. What can I do to support you? And he said, I'm working on getting it through the speaker's office, and I think we might be able to do it. And in the end, he couldn't get his own caucus to support it. And so it wasn't included in any of the CARES funding that we did. It's still one of the most important ideas that we have. And I look forward to working with him when we go back, because I think when that eviction moratorium lifts, we're going to see this crisis and we may understand that we need to do something about it quickly.
And the only thing I can add to that is if indeed my colleague and his friends are able to get that push through the House, let's just hope that it is the kind of thing that will be heard in the Senate. I do have my doubts.
We're now moving into the candid section of this forum. We appreciate you all giving us some of the inside baseball of what's going on. It helps us as observers understand it. The next segment, we wanted some predictions for you to think about what is coming. What should we be paying attention to as your constituents and business leaders and nonprofit executives and community advocates? Who would like to share some predictions? What do you think is coming in this next session? What are you concerned about? Maybe what are you hopeful for? I see you reaching, Senator Foushee. Go ahead.
Wow, you can't hide anything on Zoom. Let me just start by saying that I think a lot of what we'll be able to do is going to be contingent on the metrics as they relate to COVID and any federal assistance that we get moving into the 2021-2022 biennium. I think that, as I said earlier, our main focus when we go back should be about ensuring that our people are healthy, that we are able to put forward not just policy, but funding that will ensure that small businesses in particular are able to thrive. I think that we know that folk have, to the extent that they could be, they have been patient. They've gone through periods of time where they could not open, so they could not generate revenue. Then we went through a period where there was assistance that was offered that was not equitably distributed. Now we're going through a period where we're in fear of whether or not we're going to have to close down all over again and repeat what we went through for 4 of the last 8 to 9 months. So I think that going forward with a legislature that has seen and heard from the people of North Carolina saying we need help, we have elected you to provide that assistance. We want you to get together and talk about us and not yourselves. We want you to provide access to broadband. We want you to ensure that we are healthy. We want to make sure that our jobs remain in place. We don't want to have to ask for assistance, but because we need assistance to get over this hump, we want you to talk about providing that assistance. And we want you to come out of your corners and move to the center and help us help the people of North Carolina who put you there to talk about how we thrive, not just as individuals, but as a state. And we can't do it without your help. I think that you will see a legislature that will understand that the people of North Carolina kept in place a Republican legislature, but it also kept in place a Democratic governor that is saying, you guys need to work together. And this is what we need. I'm hoping that a lot of our attention will go to ensuring that those businesses that have 50 or less employees have their needs addressed, because we know that is the backbone of our economy. If we don't do that, then we have failed all of you and we've failed ourselves.
I'm gonna let that sink in with folks. I hope all of us out there are championing what Senator Foushee just said. That is this movement towards the middle. The sane center needs to stand up and bring people together to help address these issues. And I really appreciate your leadership there, Senator Foushee. Representative Insko, would you like to comment on what your predictions are? What do you think is coming? What are you optimistic about? Or maybe a little bit, what are you afraid of?
I do think I really appreciate Senator Foushee for her comments. I do think that the public can have a big input this year. I have some concerns about a discussion about another tax cut. I think tax cuts have been on the agenda for every session. That's been a goal, is to have some kind of tax cut. I think I'm very concerned about small businesses and about our economy, and making sure that we find a balance between protecting our health, and we can do both. We can protect our health and support our economy. We just need to work together and come together to do that. We've really got to stop attacking each other. And this is a crisis here that's not going to get better until we find a way to work together. I really do believe that, and I think the public can help. I think Senator Fouschee's right, that if the public will respond, that we'll get a lot more. If the public will take the lead in some ways, because I don't think that we have really united leadership at the state level at all.
Thank you. Representative Meyer.
I want to forecast that I think the single biggest thing that's going to happen in this year's legislative session is our redistricting, because we redistrict in the first year of every new decade after we get the census results back, and that draws the maps for the next 10 years pending court challenges. But I think that what you're likely to see is that North Carolina is about as closely divided politically as you can imagine. I mean, our statewide races were mostly decided, almost all of them were decided by fewer than 100,000 votes out of 5.5 million. You know, we have the Chief Justice race that's going to come down to 400 or so votes out of 5.5 million. And so in statewide races, we will see that North Carolina will continue to be represented by Democrats and Republicans. And maybe over the next decade, just based on population trends, maybe increasingly towards Democrats at the statewide level. But in the legislature, once we draw these maps, because of the court rulings on gerrymandering over the last couple of years, and because Republicans retain control, they will likely be able to successfully use partisan gerrymandering to maintain their control of the legislature for additional terms after this one. I mean, we're going to try our best to win a Democratic majority, as we have, but it's not going to be easy because of the structural advantage that they'll have from gerrymandering. And so I think that means that, to the point that is being made here and that Aaron is really emphasizing, we're going to have to learn how to work together, because we've tried over the last couple of years to steal the leadership away from one another. And now when I'm looking at the next 10 years, I'm just thinking nobody's going to have dominant control, not at all. And so there could be just continued struggle between the legislative branch and the executive branch, but I think both the legislative branch and the executive branch are going to be fairly equally balanced between Democrats and Republicans. And I really just hope we'll have a different approach to all of the work.
Our final segment is questions from the gathered that are here observing. Some of them have been typed in. You're welcome to type them in as well. And conceivably, we could call on you also, and you could ask your question out loud if you would like to do that. There's a little raise your hand function if folks want to be called on. While folks think about that question, I want to come back to broadband just for a second. So each of you said it was important. But can you help us understand what you can do about it, other than say it's important? What can the state legislature do to expand broadband access? And just before you say that, I want to say a special thank you. Carlos Sanchez is with us on this call. Carlos is a senior vice president for AT&T. They have done an exceptional job of providing much of the services being used across the state. I may, if he's willing, if he has comments to talk about what they're going to be doing. But from a legislative perspective, what can you do?
I can jump in on this one. So, I mean, ultimately, the legislature has two powers to address broadband. We have our regulatory authority and we have our financial ability to address broadband. And the Republican legislative leadership has not really used their regulatory authority to do anything to promote rural broadband expansion. In fact, they did more to restrict rural broadband expansion when they took control in 2010, and they passed a bill that made it difficult for local governments to play a role in broadband expansion. So the most of the emphasis of what has been done by the legislature has been on the appropriations side, essentially paying for broadband infrastructure to be built through the GREAT grant program, which has had, I think, somewhere between $30 and $50 million total. But we probably have $1.5 billion of a problem for broadband in North Carolina. So we either need to make a huge state investment or we need to build on top of the federal investment, which is where I think this set of federal grants that I mentioned earlier coming is really going to help. The other thing that we can do that is really tinkering around the edges as legislators is we can help individual constituents and their communities work with the telecom providers like AT&T and like Carlos to figure out what might be available for them. So one of the things that I've done with a number of Orange County communities is to help their homeowners association or just a group of neighbors try and connect with broadband providers and get a bid for a build out into their area and figure out if there's a way that they can finance it themselves. But that is still really just the private market working, and me just being a facilitator as a communicator. It's I'm happy to do it in a constituent services role, but it's no way to figure out how to get broadband to everybody, even in my district, much less the whole state.
So I'd like to pick up from where Greg left off, saying that I think there ought to be some regulatory issues that we could look at. If we look back in history, Wilson has a really great system that they initiated. Now, there's some constitutional issues with the public sector competing with the private sector here in North Carolina. But I think that there's a more initiative that could come from the local levels if we could figure out a way to bridge that gap between public sector and private sector. And I think there are other issues other than broadband, but I think that we ought to be looking, we ought to try to be working across the aisle to look at that issue. But whether or not there's some way for cities and counties and multiple communities to have more of a partnership, and at least in the initial part, and then if we have to transition it, that there'd be some way to do that, and with financial support back for the people who help put it in. I've been very discouraged that we haven't been able to look at that. The issue hasn't come up very well.
And to Representative Insko's point, I've introduced legislation that would do just that, but certainly it has not gone past introduction.
And I don't mean just, I'm not sure what your legislation was. I apologize. I had to
No. It was to allow for partnerships between the public-private partnerships.
I suspect that there are multiple ways to do that, and that different counties and different groups of counties would have different ideas. We just need to get some of those things on the table for people to look at. I hope we can do that. File your bill again.
So to the audience, what questions do you have? Your legislators are here to hear from you, to answer your questions, or to hear your comments about what your priorities are. I'll ask our guests. I'm going to be a little less formal here and calling on each of you one at a time. Just unmute yourself and have at it.
Aaron, there are a few questions or comments in the chat that I've been monitoring that I'm happy to surface for discussion. On this public-private partnership conversation thread that we're on right now related to broadband, Sonia Frischmeyer is raising it for other areas beyond broadband and looking at, is there a way to be more collaborative with public-private partnerships? And she pointed out My Future NC, which is an education initiative to help North Carolina meet the labor demands projected by 2020. And apparently there's about 500,000 post-secondary degree holder gap for our workforce across the state. And she asked, why is there such a disconnect between collaborative public-private initiatives such as My Future NC and the state budget? Is that something one of our representatives would like to speak to?
Well, I'd say we really ought to look at it, and that, that's something that either party could do, or we could do it collaboratively. That's, we need to be thinking about all the options and being creative, exploring new ways of doing things. I think the times just demand it, and I think that's going to be true, increasingly true as we move forward. That we've got to look at new ways of solving problems. And I think actually the younger generation's good at that, because we've got, with our connectivity changing, the way we work together changing. And so I think we're seeing movements in that direction.
Katie, what other questions? And we'll let the other representatives jump in on that if they want. But what else did you see in that in the chat?
Well, Shelley Parker just acknowledged that when it comes to public-private partnerships and collaboration, she pointed out that the state DOT should be a part of this discussion. Apparently they have federal funds for broadband. So that's I just want to raise that for the discussion. And then Katie Murray, who runs the Orange County Arts Commission, put forward a compliment to our panel, and she said, I want to thank our representatives for supporting the $9.4 million in CARES relief funding for the arts industry. She said Orange County's $166,000 is on the way to organizations who contribute $130 million to our local economy each year. And she said, we just now need some federal assistance. So if our arts community is definitely in need of support. Any thoughts there?
What other questions are there from our audience, either to raise your hand or to type in the chat? I'm going to allow an awkward silence. It's going to feel really awkward, but I know you're just about to ask the question, just about to type it. So let me encourage you to do it.
And also Jonathan Collins in the chat raised a question about redistricting and wanting to better understand maybe the mechanics of how that could play out. So that's another option for the panel to run with.
Any chance of a bipartisan or nonpartisan redistricting commission? Or is it just going to be a fight?
I don't think there's any chance of a nonpartisan redistricting commission, but I do think that if we are given the opportunity to see the process and development, that Democrats may try to lay out our own redistricting plan, and we haven't really talked about that, but we do need to. I do think that both parties see that we are. I agree with Graig that we are a purple state, and that regardless of how the maps are drawn, it's going to be there are going to be disagreements about well, there are going to be options, and I think, but I do think that you know, the first redistricting bill came from Republicans when they were in the minority, and so there's support on that side of the aisle to do it. So we ought to try to we ought to at least have that discussion and maybe keep it as public as we can.
I had earlier asked my friend Carlos, who is joining our call, to comment about broadband from an AT&T perspective. Carlos, do you have something you'd like to offer on that? Will you?
Yes, Aaron, thank you. Appreciate that. And thank you for Representative Meyer, Representative Insko, Senator Foushee. We appreciate everything you do at the legislature. Certainly, we have worked with you in different initiatives, and we look forward to 2021. There is a lot coming, and we're going to be very active there. And I appreciate the collaboration that we've had with your offices. Certainly, we have worked with a lot of your constituents. We had a very good teamwork with your staff, looking at different broadband initiatives in your areas. And I know with Representative Meyer, we've been working in different areas there. And yes, I mean, AT&T, of course, we're one of the main broadband providers, and we're definitely very much expanding into a lot of areas in our communities. There are gaps out there in rural areas that are very expensive for providers to serve. So there is a role for state government and federal government to help in this area. And I think that is all being discussed right now. I mean, grants is important, and the state has the great program, which is very helpful as well. There was CARES funding allocated this past session, which is important too. So we're working on that. I mean, hotspots for students. AT&T has been very active this past year with a lot of opportunities with local school systems providing hotspots for students across the state. We've been working with NCDCE, which is the North Carolina Business Committee for Education as well, providing Wi-Fi routers for school buses. These school buses drive around rural areas and provide kind of hotspots or public Wi-Fi for students to connect. And so we're very active. We've been extremely busy, extremely busy this past year. Of course, the pandemic has basically exacerbated the need of connectivity and broadband across the state. And we've been very busy trying to respond to all these requests, and look forward to working with all of you next year in the legislature and do as much as we can.
Carlos, thank you for being here with us and for doing what you have been doing to extend Wi-Fi, particularly to the children of our community. And it's been a very difficult thing. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
We haven't yet categorized broadband as a utility, like electricity and water, sewer, and gas and electricity. We need to be doing that. How? But would that make any difference to anybody? I mean, especially interested in Mr. Sanchez. How can we get groups of counties or local government working with the companies? I know there's a lot going on here in Orange County, but so far we haven't been able to completely bridge the gap.
Yeah, and on that topic, we feel that the private market and the competitive market has been addressing broadband, and basically the amount of investment that has come into the state of North Carolina for broadband from AT&T and different providers has been very, very high, just because there is this competitive environment, which we feel is the best way for broadband to flourish in the state.
That is a debate I'm sure that will continue into 2021. I appreciate Representative Insko, you asking the question, Carlos. Though you did not expect me to call on you, I appreciate you were willing to show your face and for folks to get to put a face with the company that's doing so much work in our community in this space.
And I want to recognize Robert Doro is with us as well. And
Robert, I am so sorry. And while you're here, every day for the next 2 weeks, y'all, we're going to be doing our Salute to Community Heroes, recognizing a firefighter or police officer in Chapel Hill, Carrboro, Hillsborough, Orange County. And you'll see Robert's face reading their citation. Yesterday was UNC Hospitals Police. We'll have another one today. So be looking for on the Facebook feed and help us really recognize extraordinary individuals in AT&T. Y'all, thank you for your sponsorship of that. What other questions are you seeing, Katie, in our chat feed here? And if not, let me ask our legislators, maybe sort of personally, what has been the most surprising thing for you over these last year as a legislator? What is, I don't know, just really surprised you in the function of government? It can be on the positive or the not so positive side.
I mean, frankly, I was really surprised
I could say that there is something that has surprised me, Aaron, but there has not. I would say, though, I am concerned that the legislature will not take up issues that relate to equity. I am disappointed that I don't believe that the legislature will take up issues that relate to policing reforms such that our society, our communities will feel comfortable with how we serve and protect. I think that it would be helpful if we were to understand that we all play a role in how we interact with and how we protect each other, that there should be a way, although we cannot legislate it, but we need to address concerns that talk about how we interact with each other as a community. I'm not surprised that we have not discussed those issues, but I would be surprised if we do.
Representative Meyer?
I was going to say, I think I was actually pleasantly surprised when COVID hit in the House. We set up bipartisan working groups, and the education working group that I served on was the most bipartisan experience that I had in my 6 years in the legislature. So I was pleasantly surprised by that. I think I was not surprised by the same things that Senator Foushee just mentioned. Just, disappointed, but not surprised.
Final question. Go ahead.
I'm concerned going forward. I had hoped that we could carry over some of that bipartisanship into this session. The Republicans are going to, I used to be a Republican. We need both parties, and our differences are really our strength. But we don't, so because neither party is correct all the time. So we actually need to work together in order to find where we can move forward. But I'm concerned that we will not be able to work across the aisle, partly because I had hoped that there would be new leadership on the other side, just as a change of pace, but there isn't. So that's one of my concerns. But I hope we can keep pushing for that. And I do agree with Graig that we have a model now with the interim where people did work together, and we can focus on that and try to get some more of that going.
Let me, as our final question, ask y'all whether our businesses can anticipate any additional financial support. So by our count, we have 49 permanent closures. 49 local businesses have closed permanently. There have been some new ones opening, and some are just barely hanging on. The North Carolina Job Retention Grant, a few of the other opportunities that have come out of NC Commerce, they've had easy applications, good, smart ways to apply, but we need more resources. Do you anticipate more funds coming from the state to support small businesses? And let me say, in all the ones that have been done, we don't give money to people who got EIDL funds or PPP. So if they got a little bit of federal, and some of them only like $4,000 worth of federal, they're now ineligible for some of the state programs. What do you think is coming in terms of financial support? Might anything be coming in terms of financial?
Well, I think we all agree that we need it. We all agree, I believe, that it's essential to do that. And that's a really good question.
Well, let us ask you to champion that for us, please.
That would be a priority for us, I think.
I think we hope that the feds will be the first actor there, and that they'll come up with a compromise package that will lay the groundwork so that we either know what they give us to appropriate, or that they provide direct supports like they did with PPP. And maybe they can design their supports better than they did the last time. But the state really needs to work around those. As I mentioned earlier, and we had a priority in the short session to try and provide direct financial assistance to businesses that were forced to close or limit their business because of COVID restrictions. And I think we can continue to advocate for exactly that approach. And I think now we have the groundwork with the governor's MER program, the MURR grant program, that really showed that you can help businesses that would close to stay open if you're able to provide them with targeted assistance for things like rent. And so maybe we can make that case more effectively in the next session.
If we can be helpful in helping design that, the MER was wonderful, except it required that you had paid rent. So many of the businesses with zero revenue for 5 months, they were offered that you'd reimburse them for the rent, but they had not been paying it. They were in too deep of trouble to do that.
Aaron, I think the governor's team changed the rules on that after the initial guidelines were issued. And so anyone who might have been eligible but hadn't paid rent should go back and look and see if you meet the new eligibility criteria.
We will double check on that and share back out with the group. That fund may now be exhausted, but if a new one comes along, we'd be looking forward to sharing that with our folks. I see our board chair, Ellen Shannon, is here with Shannon Media. We are grateful for her leadership in keeping our community so well informed through Chapel Hill Magazine and Chatham Magazine and Durham Magazine and their emails. Appreciate. We see many of our other elected officials joining us today. Katie, I'm going to bounce back to you for some closing comments after I say a special thank you, Representative Meyer, Representative Insko, Senator Foushee. We are grateful that you are fighting the good fight for us in Orange and Chatham County in our legislature. Katie?
Thanks, Aaron. Well, that was terrific. I hope everyone learned something new today that'll be useful for your organization. I know I did. I want to also give a heartfelt thank you to our special guest speakers, Representatives Insko, Meyer, and Senator Foushee. We're grateful for your time and your service to our community. I also want to thank our sponsors again for the 2020 policy series. They've made 5 thoughtful forums possible this year for us, and we're grateful. Durham Tech, Duke Energy, and Silver Spot Cinema. I want to thank our Chamber Government Affairs Committee who helped curate these important events. And as I mentioned at the start of the meeting, we will send you a link to today's video in case you wanted to go back and learn more. We'll have information very soon on our 2021 policy series, which is going through a bit of a rebranding. So get excited, stay tuned for that. Again, if you'd like to learn more about our chamber and join, just give us a call or email, and you can also go to carolinachamber.org.